Hello, computer scientists. I wanted to post a little video about immediately invoked function expressions because they are not obvious how they work. They are a way for us to define functions right at the time we want to run them. So in a normal function, what you do is you declare your function. You say, I don't know, add two integers, function add, right? And then you have your code that adds them and returns the result. And then later on, you call that function, you say, add two integers, 2 and 3, and it returns you 5, right? And so this is kind of how we're used to doing things in most languages. And, you know, the way that we have done it in Autogram is we defined a whole bunch of functions that did a specific thing, and then we call them whenever we need them. So in an immediately invoked function expression, right? So in the text and everything, I'm just going to shorten it to IIFE from now on. What we do is we have these parentheses here, right, that go around the function, and then two more right at the end that contain the arguments or parameters. So in a normal function, you have just the name of the function, whatever parameters it has, and then your code. In an immediately invoked function expression, you have your function just the same as it was before, but you have it inside two parentheses, and whatever arguments are in here are automatically passed into here. So let's see an example. In Autogram, we had initialize events, right? This was right at the bottom. This is, initialize events is the first thing that we call when our page loads. It initializes everything. And so we defined it up in our code, and then at the end of our JavaScript file, we called initialize events. So we defined it in one place, called it in another place. We could have done this, right? We could have just put parentheses around it, and it would have called it at the same time as defining it. So if we put this at the bottom of our code, right, we wouldn't need that initialize events call at the bottom, which keeps getting hidden by this stupid Google Slides thing, right? We defined it, and then we called it at the bottom. An IIFE defines it and calls it all at the same time. That's the only difference. You'll notice the code is identical. All that these parentheses do is say, run it right now. Don't define it and wait for me to run it later. Run this right now. So even when we're passing in arguments, right? So in our initialize events, we get the thumbnails from the thumbnails array, and then we say blah, 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 right? We could have passed in thumbnails, right? So if we wanted to, just a different way of writing our code, we could have gotten the thumbnails and then passed the thumbnails into as an argument to our function that we define. We could have done it this way. We did it this way inside, but we could have gotten the thumbnails first and then called initialize events with the thumbnails. If we wanted to have an IIFE do this, right? Remember how I said the second set of parentheses here is what gets passed in to the argument up here? Well, we could call get thumbnails array. It would store all the thumbnails into this thumbnails variable, and then you could use it right here. So all that this does is it makes sure that we're only running this function right when we need it, instead of defining it in advance. So if you didn't know where your thumbnails were, or you had this other kind of stuff going on, you might only want to define this function when you're actually loading your page, like when you need to run this function. So this is our initialize events. We define it. We get the thumbnails out. We call get thumbnails array, and then for each of the thumbnails we do a bunch of stuff. We could create an IIFE that gets the thumbnails array, passes it into this thumbnails variable, and then calls for each on it. So it's exactly the same in terms of what it does. It just does it all exactly at runtime instead of defining it first and then running it later. So in terms of the code and what it does inside, it's exactly the same. It's just a different way of thinking about how to define a function. You don't have to define it first and then run it. You can define it and run it all in one go, just like this. It will those little parentheses, right, mean run this right now. So as soon as JavaScript sees this, it's going to run it. It's not going to wait for me to call initialize events. It's going to run it as soon as it sees this definition. And that's the only difference, really, is are you defining it first and then calling it later, or are you defining it and running it at exactly the same time? And that's why it's called an immediately invoked function expression. Because as soon as you define it with these parentheses, it runs it. It's immediately invoked. So if you have any questions, definitely Google it and then hit me up on Discord or in the Zoom meeting, and I'll see if I can explain it better.